Hi guys, welcome back to Codemaster Coach, your medical coding tutor. First guys, let me just thank you guys for all of the comments, all of the emails in reference to these videos on the 2024 official coding guidelines. You guys are appreciating them and I enjoy doing these. I love going through these guidelines because they really make you think about different diagnoses and then what to code and what not to. So again, I appreciate all of your feedback that's coming in on these videos. Let's start off by starting where we stopped at. Let me minimize my box and let's get started. All right, we're at chapter 12, diseases of the skin and subcutaneous tissue. These codes can be found in categories L00 through L99. All right, we're at A, pressure ulcer stage codes. Now, I did make a couple of notes like I always do. I just said code assignment is generally based on provider documentation. You know, in your medical coding programs, you're taught we don't code what nurses do. We don't code what other ancillary service providers document. We only code based on physician documentation. However, the ICD-10-CM official guidelines for coding and reporting outline a few exceptions where documentation by clinicians other than the patient's provider is acceptable. So in this concept or context, clinicians other than the patient's provider refer to healthcare professionals permitted based on regulatory and accreditation requirements or internal hospital policies to document in a patient's official medical record. One of the exceptions is the depth of non-pressure chronic ulcers and pressure ulcer staging. Therefore, staging may be based on nursing documentation, but the diagnoses of the pressure ulcer should be coded on the basis of the provider's documentation. So again, if the provider did not state that there was an ulcer, we cannot code the ulcer. But when the provider does state that there is an ulcer, we can code the ulcer and we can capture the staging if it's not documented by the physician in the nursing notes. Also, staging of pressure ulcers takes into account the depth of the tissue loss and the depth of the tissue exposed. Unstageable refers to full thickness skin and tissue loss ulcers whose stage cannot be clinically determined. The true stage of an ulcer cannot be determined until all of the covering, they call it eschar or slope, the rocky feeling on top of an ulcer or an open wound. Once that's all cleaned off or removed, they call it debridement, then you can find the true stage of an ulcer. And I made a note, what is the difference between a pressure ulcer and a non-pressure ulcer? And it just says pressure ulcers and non-pressure ulcers are different types of wounds that have different causes and treatments. Pressure ulcers are caused by sustained pressure on an area of the body, which cuts off blood supply. You usually see it in your elderly when they lay in the bed in the same spot for long periods of time. Where non-pressure ulcers are caused by other factors such as poor circulation, infection, or trauma. Okay, so it makes sense. Pressure, you're blocking it off due to pressure laying in that bed, laying on those sheets long periods of time. And then non-pressure, but it's an ulcer. Think of poor circulation and infection and trauma. All right, we're down to number 1, pressure ulcer stages. It says straight from the guidelines. So let's look at pressure ulcer stages. Codes in category L89, pressure ulcer, identify the site and stage of the pressure ulcer. The ICD-10-CM classifies pressure ulcer stages based on severity, which is designated by stages 1 through 4, deep tissue pressure injury, unspecified stage, and unstageable. Assign as many codes from category L89 as needed to identify all of the pressure ulcers that the patient has if applicable. But again, I want to specify right here, ICD-10 classifies pressure ulcer stages based on severity. That's where that stage 1, 2, 3, or 4 come in, or deep tissue pressure injury, or unspecified stage, and unstageable. Okay? 2, unstageable pressure ulcer, straight from the guidelines. Okay? Assignment of the code for unstageable ulcer, pressure ulcer, it's L89 point and it ends in a 0, should be based on clinical documentation. These codes are used for pressure ulcers whose stage cannot be clinically determined. For example, the ulcer is covered by that eschar or has been treated with the skin or muscle graft. This code should not be confused with the codes for unspecified stage, which is L89 and it ends in a 9. And when there is no documentation regarding the stage of the pressure ulcer, then assign the appropriate code for unspecified stage, L89 ending in 9. Now, if during an encounter, the stage of an unstageable pressure ulcer is revealed after the debridement, after they do the procedure to scrape away all of that schloof and eschar, then assign only the code for the stage revealed following the debridement. Okay? 3, documented pressure ulcer stage. What if it is documented? All right? Assignment of the pressure ulcer stage code should be guided by clinical documentation of the stage or documentation of the term found in the alphabetic index. For clinical terms describing the stage that are not found in the alphabetic index, and there is no documentation of the stage, then the provider should be queried straight from the guidelines. All right. 4, patient admitted with pressure ulcer documented as healed, past tense, healed. Look at 4. No code is assigned if the documentation states that the pressure ulcer is completely healed at the time of the admission. Services won't be rendered, resources won't be used on this ulcer because it no longer exists. It's healed. Therefore, no code is assigned. 5, pressure ulcers documented as healing, is still in the process. So we're in the guidelines. 5, pressure ulcers described as healing should be assigned the appropriate pressure ulcer stage code based on the documentation in the medical record. Now, if the documentation does not provide information about the stage of the healing pressure ulcer, then assign the appropriate code for unspecified stage. If the documentation is unclear as to whether the patient has a current or new pressure ulcer, or if the patient is being treated for a healing pressure ulcer, query the provider. For ulcers that are present on admission but healed at the time of discharge, assign the code for the site and stage of the pressure ulcer at the time of admission. Because think about it, the facility needs to be reimbursed for all the work that they did to heal that pressure ulcer. So again, for ulcers that were present on admission, it was there, but it healed at the time of discharge, then assign a code for the site and stage of the pressure ulcer at the time of the admission, because it shows that the work was done to heal it. So the facility should get reimbursed. All right, we're down to number 6. Patient admitted with pressure ulcer evolving into another stage during the admission. And I got a note here that says guidelines, 2 codes assigned. If a patient is admitted to an inpatient hospital with a pressure ulcer at one stage and it progresses to a higher stage, 2 separate codes should be assigned. One code for the site and stage of the ulcer on admission, and a second code for the same ulcer site at the highest stage reported during the stay. So again, if it progresses or evolves, then identify what it was on admission and also identify what it is, or it at its highest stage level. That leads us to number 7. Pressure-induced deep tissue damage, straight from the guidelines. For pressure-induced deep tissue damage or deep tissue pressure injury, assign only the appropriate code for pressure-induced deep tissue damage. And that's going to be found in L89 and then the last digit 6. Those were pressure ulcers. Now look at non-pressure chronic ulcers. Go back to my guideline. Yep. Patient admitted with non-pressure ulcer documented as healed, past tense. These two different types of ulcers. This is the past tense. Refer to the guidelines. No code is assigned if the documentation states that the non-pressure ulcer is completely healed at the time of admission. Again, if it's not present, don't code it. Okay? Number 2, non-pressure ulcer documented as healing, still in the process, still present tense, refer to the guidelines. Non-pressure ulcers described as healing should be assigned the appropriate non-pressure ulcer code based on the documentation in the medical record. If the documentation does not provide information about the severity of the healing non-pressure ulcer, then assign the appropriate code for unspecified severity. And if the documentation is unclear as to whether the patient has a current or new non-pressure ulcer, or if the patient is being treated for a healing non-pressure ulcer, then query the provider. For ulcers that were present on admission but healed at the time of discharge, again, assign the code for the site and severity of the non-pressure ulcer at the time of admission. Again, we want to show that due to the care that was rendered while the patient was being treated, the ulcer got better. So we should be compensated for it. So code at its degree on admission. And 3, patient admitted with a non-pressure ulcer that progresses to another severity level during the admission. If a patient is admitted to an inpatient hospital with a non-pressure ulcer at one severity level and it progresses to a higher severity level, 2 separate codes should be assigned. One code for the site and severity level of the ulcer on admission, and a second code for the same ulcer site and the highest severity level reported during the stay. All right, next week we'll be on chapter 13, disease of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue. We'll be in range M00 through M99. Again, guys, thanks for all of your support on these videos on these official coding guidelines. And again, don't forget, I'll be starting a class. It'll start next Tuesday. We'll send out all welcome packages on Sunday to all students that have registered for class to start on Tuesday coming. So if you're looking for a medical coding program, don't forget to email me at codemastercoach@gmail.com. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next week.